Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Census Data Seminar. Our topic today is migration within Australia. I'm joining you from the lands of the Turrbal people in Brisbane and would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet and extend that acknowledgement across all the lands we are broadcasting to today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining our seminar today. My name is Tanya Hornick, and I work in the Location Insights branch at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Today, we will be hearing from three panellists. Firstly will be Andrew Howe, who is a demographer in the ABS demography team at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Second will be Caroline Deans, Director, 2021 Census Dissemination, also at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And thirdly will be Alex Cleland, Assistant Director at the Centre for Population at the Treasury. We will hear some insights about internal migration data today. Internal migration data allows us to understand the movements of our population across and within the entire country and over time. We will look at the history of this data, how the census provides a unique insight into movement of people around Australia, and how this data is used by others to make forecasts and projections and inform decision-making. During the session, we will have time to answer your questions. So if you go to pollev.com/2021 Census MWA, that's migration within Australia, on your computer or mobile device, you can submit your questions at any time. After we've shared some data with you, I'll be back to put these questions to our panel members. Now I'll hand over to Andrew Howe, who will share his insights on the history of internal migration within Australia. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Tanya. So how we move around significantly shapes our communities. Where we all live has been influenced by migration over past generations as people move in and out. Inner cities, suburbia, regional centres and rural areas have all been shaped by past migration and will continue to develop from future migration patterns. So migration is one of two broad demographic factors that shape our population, the other being natural increase. Well, that's births minus deaths. At the national level, only overseas migration is relevant. So since Federation in 1901, natural increase has actually given Australia most of its growth, around 60%. Only 40% of growth was from overseas migration. So over these 120 years, events such as war and recession influence this breakdown of population growth. In recent decades, however, led by a student boom, the share flipped to mostly overseas migration-led growth. However, with the more recent closing of international borders, overseas migration halted and actually went negative for a year or two. But when it comes to how people are distributed within Australia, internal migration comes into play. So this impacts electoral representation, where resources and grants are allocated, and where we build infrastructure and provide services. Internal migration also impacts the age structure of populations. It's the younger adults who move to the inner cities. It's growing families that relocate to the outer suburbs, and retirees move up or down the coast. The exodus of young adults can transform middle suburbia and reinvigorate regions through generational shifts. When Australia transformed from states to a federation in 1901, interstate migration was the most important measured geography, rather than movements, say, between the country and the city or between towns. Data on Indigenous population migration was virtually non-existent, or was non-existent, unlike what we can now get from the census. From the 1901 census, there's this interesting matrix I've got on the screen of birth, matrix of state of birth by state of enumeration. So this reveals net interstate moves for people over their lifetimes. If you were born in Tasmania, but were enumerated in Queensland, you're counted as one net person move to Queensland. So the biggest flows at the time were from Victoria and South Australia to Western Australia and New South Wales. The net effects are a large positive inflow for Western Australia and smaller net inflows for New South Wales and Queensland. So they're those black bars on the chart, if you can see that, above zero. More people moving into these states than moving out. On the flip side, lots more Victorians were moving out than in, and the net outflows for South Australia and Tasmania were also relatively high. Back. So here, with this slide, we see how the younger states were populated on top of any overseas migration and natural increase. And in a broad sense, how Australia was populating north and west from the main overseas arrival ports in the southeast of the country throughout the 1800s. So these trends also set the scene for much of the 20th century. Up until the 1930s, rail accounted for 3/4 of recorded interstate movements, with moves by sea taking up the rest. Between the 1933 and the 1947 censuses, air travel made up 10% of interstate trips. Trips by air then rose steeply to 70% by the next census in the mid-50s. So when we combine the moves by sea, rail and air, we see around 700,000 border crossings every year up until the 1930s. Depression and World War II then reduced moves through to the late 40s. But with increased air travel and large numbers coming in from overseas, especially into Melbourne and Sydney, and then relocating within Australia, interstate moves jumped in the 1950s. Road trips went virtually unrecorded at the time. This 1954 census report shows a net adjustment of around 70,000 Victorians moving to New South Wales and 10,000 moving from New South Wales to the ACT since that previous census, 1947, assumed to be from road travel. Interstate movements by bus were also recorded through the 1960s. This 1961 census report showed that Victoria gained a net 40,000 people by air, but lost almost 50,000 by rail. The data also records Victoria losing 35,000 people from the Bonegilla Migrant Centre near Wodonga into New South Wales. The report also has Canberra now gaining a net 5,000 people per year by road travel. The 1961 census also revealed that Queensland, WA and the NT combined gained a net 60,000 born in other states since 1954, and the fast-growing Federal Capital Territory gained around 25,000 Australian born. Meanwhile, the other states lost a combined 85,000 Australian born, with Tasmania losing 40,000 in just 7 years. Now, all these states were still growing in population, at least from natural increase in overseas migration. However, internal migration was a big player in changing the share and the structure of the populations of these states and territories. Okay, so up until now, I've been literally quoting a number of border crossings rather than people actually changing their residential address. In the 1960s, however, with higher interstate travel becoming harder to keep track of, interstate migration was then recorded more on a change of residential address basis. initially from sources such as family allowances and electoral rolls. Since the mid-1980s, Medicare has been our main source of regular internal migration data. So as you update your address on the Medicare system, that aggregated information turns into migration data. The census, of course, continues to be a vital source of internal migration data with its questions on where you were living 1 and 5 years ago. Census migration also lets us calibrate that administrative data because we know Medicare doesn't capture all residential moves, nor is it as timely as we want. With annual data starting in 1971, we now have a 50-year interstate migration series to explore and blend with the other components of natural increase and overseas migration. This lets us estimate how and why populations change the way they do. So quickly looking at net interstate migration levels for each state since the 1970s. First up, New South Wales. We see New South Wales has almost always had a negative net flow. More people move out than in New South Wales. So that blue line is below the origin for almost every year since 1971. So note the big net outflows in the late 80s and the very early 2000s, which correspond with increases in overseas migration and Sydney house prices in those periods. Victoria was also traditionally negative, especially in the early to mid 1990s, with recession and economic restructuring impacting the state. However, Victoria switched to a net positive around 25 years ago, although has suddenly reverted back to negative with the pandemic. So Victoria will be a really interesting state to keep track of over the next few years. Will that long-term traditional net outflow continue, or will we go back to the net inflow of the last 2 decades or so? Queensland, always been a net positive. More people moving in than out other parts of Australia. And now if you start looking at the other states in conjunction with the main state on the screen, you'll see corresponding troughs and peaks. So Queensland, we have peaks in the late 80s, early 90s, which correspond to troughs in New South Wales and Victoria in those years. For Western Australia has been up and down over those 50 years, mostly above zero though, a net gainer of people from other parts of the country. Western Australia's cycle especially happens around mining cycles. You can see the big trough during the last mining bust and then a very recent recovery in the last year or so. For South Australia, we have mostly negative, mostly net outflows. South Australia is interesting in that on the 90s in particular, following Victoria's economic demise and restructure back in the 90s, its interstate migration trend followed. So South Australia traditionally net negative, although it was recently approached and even flipped over to positive in pandemic year 2021. Northern Territory. Changes in the resource and defence sectors leads to an interesting shape. And I'm sure if you're looking, you'll also notice the big negative spike in 1975, which coincides with an almost identical upward spike for South Australia in that year. This is from Cyclone Tracy evacuees. Another small state such as Tasmania, we see really pushed around by the other states in terms of like a small relative outflow of New South Wales or Victorian migrants, the big states, is large in Tasmanian terms. So we see Tasmania often being a mirror image of New South Wales net migration over the decades. While the ACT has rises and falls as well, traditionally corresponding with expansions and contractions in the Commonwealth government sector. So these simple net interstate migration charts over time help explain the history of our states and territories. So over these last 50 years, the ongoing impact of interstate migration has been large, especially for Queensland and New South Wales. but in opposite directions. So crudely speaking, Queensland would have around 1 million people less with no internal migration since the 1970s, while New South Wales would be around 10% higher, its total population. And honing in on the other states, Victoria has mostly lost people this way. The surge of the 2010s for Victoria, the net inflow, didn't claw back all those losses from previous decades. And you can see on the screen a sudden reversal in the pandemic year for Victoria. South Australia also lost significant numbers. Western Australia creeping back towards a net inflow of 100,000 since 1971, so above that line, that origin line. And Canberra, the ACT, has gained a net 60,000 or so over this time. So around 360,000 people move interstate annually, or 1,000 a day. So this represents about 1.5% of the population moving between states each year. However, internal migration isn't just a story of interstate migration, far from it. In fact, interstate moves are only a small proportion of total movers. The 2021 census told us that 3.5 million people changed their address in the previous year, around 10,000 people moving every day. Over the course of our lifetimes, we change residence around 12 times over our lifetimes based on current rates, once every 7 or so years. So only around 1 in 10 of these moves are interstate. If we break the country into combined capitals and the rest of the country, we already see more movers to and from these two broad regions. So this indicates people move more over shorter distances, such as Sydney retirees moving just up the coast, or Ballarat kids moving to Melbourne for uni, rather than, say, an interstate move between Perth and Brisbane. 1 in 6 moves are between greater capital statistical areas, GCCSAs, which are the individual capital cities, and rest of state areas. Into SA4 migration represents almost 40% of movers. So Caroline will mention some SA4s shortly. Into SA3s, 54% of movers. And then moves between the smaller SA2s are 79% of all moves based on last year's census. The remaining 21% of moves are within SA2s. So the smaller the area, the more frequent the moves are between these areas, is the main point of this slide. So through census data, we can explore the detailed characteristics of these moves right down to SA2 level. And with that, I'll pass over to Caroline.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me just take control of the slides. That was a really interesting introduction. I was getting captivated in the history there and your map. So apologies for being a bit late to unmute. So as Andrew said, I am going to talk about what the 2021 census revealed in internal migration. And I'll start by showing you the 2 questions that Andrew did mention in his presentation, because this is really fundamental to understanding how we measure internal migration in the census. So you might remember when you're filling in your census form that you get asked where you usually live, but you also get asked, where did you live 1 year ago? And that was at the 10th of August 2020. And you get asked, where did you usually live 5 years ago? So that's going back to the 10th of August 2016. So really covering that time span between each census. And from this information, we can get indicators that show whether a person's moved or not, as well as Andrew said, the address or the region that they're moving to or moving from. But what that does mean is that unlike the administrative data that is being used, the Medicare data and so on that's being used to track movements on a quarterly basis, the census only measures 3 points in time, and I've got those on the timeline down the bottom there. So we've got 2021 in August, 2020 in August, and then 4 years prior to that, 2016 in August. So when we look at the census, we talk mainly about what's happened in the last year and what's happened in the last 5 years. So in between that time, a person could have moved multiple times. They could have moved around the corner in 2016, across the country in 2018, back to their original state in 2019, and then maybe they stayed put for a couple of years. So we can't see in the census those moves within those three reference points. Today, I'm going to start by talking about some of the 5-year observations that we can make, and then I'm going to have a look at the 1 year ago, what some characteristics of what's happened in the last year, the last year before the census. And when I'm doing that, I'm going to focus on a case study of Melbourne, because that, as we probably all remember, was very badly affected by COVID during these times. So I'm going to drill into what has happened in internal migration in Melbourne. And it probably is worth just reminding us all of what was going on in Australia at the 10th of August in 2021 when we sat down and completed our census form. And that was that we were still in the midst of the pandemic. And in fact, on the 10th of August last year, about half the country was actually in lockdown. Sydney had been in lockdown for several weeks at that time, and it had extended out to the regional parts of New South Wales as we got closer to census night. And then also Victoria was in lockdown in the couple of weeks and across census night. So that means that the census was taken at a really unique point in time. And we need to bear that in mind while we are interpreting the data, because that does play out when we look at internal migration data, and it also does play out when we look at other data collected on the census. If you are interested, a few weeks ago we recorded a seminar just looking at the COVID impacts on the data, and we talked about some of the internal migration impacts at that time, but we also looked at changes in occupation and industry. We looked in differences in patterns of how people worked, whether they worked at home, how they got to work. So we're not going to cover any of that today, but if you are interested in how to interpret the census data during COVID, look at that seminar from several weeks ago. So let's get into the data for the 2021 census. And what I've got here is just a simple measure of the question, where did people live 5 years ago? And across 3 census time points. The peach-coloured bar there is in 2011, when people were asked about where they lived 5 years ago in 2006. The dark orange-coloured bar is 2016, asking where did they live in 2011. And the teal-coloured bar is the responses in 2021. Where did they live 5 years ago in 2016? And I'll use these colours throughout, and I'll only have to explain that once. But what this is showing here is reasonably consistent patterns over the last 3 census cycles, despite what we now know of the pandemic affecting our movements. So you can see in 2021, that 53% of the population didn't move in that 5-year period. And that's very similar to what was measured the 2 censuses prior. The movements elsewhere in Australia were just about a third. About 1 in 3 people moved elsewhere in Australia. And as Andrew pointed out, most of those moves were actually quite local moves, around the corner rather than across the country. And then we do see the people coming in from overseas, and that's about 5%, and that did decrease as measured in the 2021 census. So I'm going to focus first on interstate migration, remembering that this is referring to this. It includes just about 10% of of the move. So it's in fact in that 5-year period, it's just under 1 million people who reported in the census that they had lived in another state or territory 5 years prior. So what we've got here are net measures of migration by the states and territories. And you can see that Queensland is the largest increase there. And as Andrew pointed out, this is continuing a pattern that's been observed in Queensland over a very long time. But in the 2021 census, just over 100,000 net people moved interstate to Queensland. And you can see that New South Wales has been negative in the last few cycles, but then had 100,000 or just over 100,000 net loss between those census periods. And Victoria had been positive over the last couple, but then was negative in that 5-year period, again to the 2021 census. And in fact, you can see that the only states and territories with net gains from interstate were Queensland, Tasmania, and the ACT. All the other jurisdictions experienced a net loss to interstate migration. So this chart here is in the number of people who have moved. So you can see it quite clearly of what's happening in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, the largest states. But another way to look at internal migration is to look at a measure of population turnover. And again, we're looking at this on a 5-year period. And what we do here is we add up the gross moves. So that's both the ins and the outs. So the arrivals and the departures get added up and then divided by the population. So when we look at Queensland there, the ins plus the outs works out to about 92 people per 1,000 residents turnover in a 5-year period. And again, that's been really consistent. And in fact, it's been consistent across most of the big states over those last 3 census cycles. When we get to the Northern Territory, if you have a look at that number there in 2021, it's about 330. So that means 330 people out of every 1,000. So 1 in 3 people in the Northern Territory turns over that period of 5 years. And that's been, again, fairly consistent over the last three census cycles. And this makes a really interesting challenge in the Northern Territory for delivering services and developing policies and really supporting the population who live there when you have got such churn in the population. We did release an article today on population movements, and I'm just pulling some of the examples from that today. But if you're interested in more detail about the Northern Territory, go to our website and have a look at our article because that goes into it in a lot more detail. It's a very interesting case study. But one thing I am going to show today is the age profile of people in the Northern Territory, of the age of arrivals and the age of departures. I'm again looking at this 5-year period between August 2016 and 2021. And you can see, generally speaking, people are moving to the Territory in their 20s, with peak around about 26 or so. And the kids who are moving into the Territory are quite young, the 5-year-olds or young children. And then the people who are leaving the Northern Territory, or who left the Northern Territory between August 2016 and August 2021, the kids are that bit older, and they're also the parents are moving in their 30s. If their families that are moving, parents are moving in their 30s. So that age shift that you can see there is really just suggesting that turnover of 1 in 3 people every 5 years. Another thing we looked at in our case study was about people's employment and their education. And as one of the great benefits of the census is that it doesn't just show you the population movements, but it allows us to look at other characteristics of the people who have moved. So one thing that we had a look at for the Northern Territory was whether they're working or studying. And what you can see here is that of the people who arrived in the Territory from another territory 5 years prior, 60% of them were working. Of those who left, it was a smaller number, but it was still more than the population who didn't move at all. That was about 40% of the population who didn't move in that period were engaged in full-time employment. And we see a slightly different pattern when we look at whether people are engaged in full-time study, where the arrivals are at a lower rate of engagement and the departures are at a higher rate. And I should say this is only for people aged 15 to 64. We've removed from this children and also people who are pensioners of retired age. And then the population who is not engaged in either employment, education or training, much larger proportion of those who are not moving are not engaged in employment, education or training compared to the people who had arrived in the Northern Territory or departed. So that's just a little snapshot of what we can see in the census when we want to drill into one particular observation of interest. So now I'm going to switch to talking about internal migration, the regional form of internal migration, because I said earlier that only 1 in 10 actually moved interstate. The majority of moves are more local. So let's have a look at those regional moves. And first, looking at the capital cities over the last 3 census cycles. So these are using that variable that Andrew mentioned, the GCCSA, the Greater Capital City Statistical Area. And what you can see there above the line is Brisbane had a large net growth in the 5 years to the 21 census, and also Sydney and Melbourne had large decreases. So that's when we just look at it this way, it seems that that's consistent with what we see as the state picture. And Melbourne's been an interesting case there because for the 2 previous census cycles, it's been a little bit below zero, a little bit above zero, and then the pandemic really increased the number of people who are moving out of Melbourne in the 5 years to 2021. So I'm going to do the flip side of that and show you the rest of state for for that same data. So when we talk about New South Wales generally being below the line in terms of the net interstate migration, it's really driven by Sydney, because you can see that the rest of New South Wales has got more people moving in and about the regions, same as Victoria, and that really increased in the last 5 years to the 2021 census. Queensland has been a bit up and down, but always positive in the rest of Queensland. So let's have a look at Melbourne, but now I'm going to look at a 1 year period. So remembering that we're now looking at the period from August 2020 through to August 2021. So now we're looking at this 1 year ago variable over the last 3 census cycles. And this is again looking at the Greater Capital City area of Melbourne. And what we're breaking down in this internal migration is the arrivals, the departures, and the net. So just talking you through that, the arrivals in the peach colour showing as just under 60,000. The departures are people who left Melbourne in the year prior to 2011, just over 60,000, which gives a net effect of just about 3,000 or 4,000. And you can see that again in that 1 year prior to the 2016 census, a very similar pattern can be seen with just over 60,000 arriving and about 60,000 leaving, giving us a slight net gain before the 2016 census. But then when we go to look at what happened in the year to 2021, you can see that the arrivals into the Greater Melbourne area were about the same. We're still around that 60,000, but the departures were much higher. Then that's led to that big net loss out of the Melbourne greater city area. So where did they go? So if we look at here, looking at that orange bar, that 100,000 people who left Melbourne in the year to August 21, where did they go? They mainly went to the rest of the Victoria. So 39% of people moving out of Melbourne moved elsewhere in Victoria, to somewhere in regional Victoria, with 21% moving to Queensland, 17% moving to New South Wales, and then smaller amounts to the other states. So I've got just one map to show you, and I mentioned the article that we released today. We also released an interactive map as part of that, so you can go in and play with the map yourself and have a look at the area that you're interested in. But this view that I'm showing here is just of Victoria net migration between August 2020 and August 21. The blue shaded areas all had a net increase in people, and this is at an SA4 level. So these large regional areas are called SA4s. So they're people who moved from another SA4 into that one. It doesn't capture movement within that SA4. So if we look at the darkest blue region, there is Geelong and the Surf Coast, and there was more than 4,000 people moved into that region from another SA4, either in Victoria or elsewhere in the country. And the other blue shaded areas also had a net positive or net gain of people moving. And then the red and the peach shaded areas are the areas that had a net loss. And you can see quite clearly that all of the Melbourne greater capital city area experienced that loss, and the inner city that you can't see as well had a smaller loss, but certainly the suburbs of Melbourne really did decrease quite a bit in that 1 year to 2021. So that's just been a quick tour through the data in the census, and there is so much there. So I'd encourage you to go and play with it yourself, because it's all free and available on the website, the ABS website. I will just show you one trick that I've only just learnt about playing with data, so you can get these net gains or net calculations yourself, and that's using our Table Builder product. Again, Table Builder has been made free. Table Builder Pro is now a free product. You just need to register and then you log in. And then it's quite straightforward. I think I'm going to show you at the state level. You just drag in two variables into Table Builder. So in this case, I have got dragged into my rows the state of usual residence in August 2021, and across the columns there are the place of usual residence 1 year ago. And when you drag them together, you can see the ones I've shaded down in that diagonal bar, they haven't moved, but every other cell in that table represents a movement, in this case between states, but you can also do this with LGAs or SA2s if you really wanted to, or SA4s, any area of interest, so that you can see what your net gain has been and where the movements have come to and from. And you can look at the arrivals by looking at your columns there, and your departures by looking at your rows. Other way around, and remembering to take out your overseas and not stated, which I've just put those columns in there. So fairly straightforward calculation, so you can work out your own net gains and net losses if you are interested in other areas. And the last little plug is I mentioned a map. So we've got a map available linked through the article on our website. And that's looking, we'll let you have a look at the SA4 regions for 2 time periods, for the 2016 cycle and for the 2021 census cycle. And you can toggle on different layers there of the net change, the arrivals, the departures, and you can flip between 1 year ago and 5 years ago and zoom in and out, and you can see some quite interesting observations there in the data. So that is all I'm going to talk about. Now I've given you that whirlwind tour, but I am going to pass over now to Alex, who is joining us from the Centre for Population, which is part of the Treasury. And I think it's great that we are able to bring along our key data users like Alex to show what other organisations can do when they take census data or they take ABS data and they do really interesting stuff with it. So passing over to you now, Alex.
Thank you, Caroline. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Alex Cleland, and I'm an Assistant Director in the Modelling and Forecasting Unit in the Centre for Population. I'm really privileged to be able to speak to you all today on census data, particularly net internal migration data. It's a bit of a dream for a data nerd like me, so thanks for the opportunity. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on how we use data from the census to model the age structure of sub-state internal migration. So I'm really glad that Caroline shared that age structure chart for arrivals and departures for the NT, because that will be a really good visual to have in your mind as I talk, because I'll be talking about age structure a lot. And we do our modelling based on the 5 year ago address data from the census. And so it's really important that we can get that data. But before I start and dive into the methods we use and how we do that, I'm going to quickly introduce the Centre for Population and provide some context as to why the Centre is so interested in the 2021 census data. So I'll move to the next slide. So the Centre for Population is a branch within the Commonwealth Treasury. Our function, we have a lot of functions, but our main function is to support the Treasurer by engaging with stakeholders to provide a strong evidence base for policy. Like in a nutshell, that's what we do. Important Treasury functions like understanding how much revenue the country is going to have and how much expenditure the government can forecast is, based on good population projections. And of course, labour and economic conditions have a population component as well. So it's really important for the Treasury to understand how the population is going to be changing in the future and the trends that are driving that change. So a major part of our work program is preparing regular population projections, which during the pandemic has been a very challenging but intensely fun process. It's been a bit of a dream to be able to forecast the population during COVID. Things are changing so quickly and it's a lot of fun, but challenging. So let's talk about the projections that the Centre produces. So we produce projections at 3 levels. So we have a national population projection and the components of growth that drive population over the future period. Then we also have state and territory projections. And then Andrew and Caroline have both introduced the concept of the GCCSA, the capital city and rest of state area. So we do projections on that basis. So we project the population for Brisbane and the rest of Queensland as well. And you can find those on our website, which I'll spruik again towards the end. So let's turn now to how we use census data to model the age structure of internal migration. So we start by jumping into the Census Table Builder, which Caroline gave us a great little introduction into. It's a great product. We use it a lot when we get the chance to. And what we do is we identify, much like Caroline's matrix, we identify the arrivals and departures by age and sex for each of our geographies. So let's say for Darwin, we'll have an age structure chart like Caroline showed for the NT. And I think when you start to look at subpopulations by age and sex, you start to get some noise in your data. And you can imagine how much the data jumps around from single years of age. So the number of 57-year-old men departing Darwin might be very different to the number of 58-year-olds just by chance, and even lower than the 56-year-olds. So there's noise in the data, and that's something that happens a lot when you start to dive into the table builder and start to break your data down by lots of different variables. You start to get some noise. So all good data, even when it's noisy, has a signal in it. And we're really interested in that signal. What's the underlying signal about the intensity of migration that we can derive from that and remove some of that, that noise? So let me show you the model we use to do that. So this is the model migration schedule, but this one was developed by Dr. Tom Wilson at the University of Melbourne. He's a fantastic demographer in Australia. If you're ever interested in the real nitty-gritty of demographic methods, definitely a good person to Google. So how does this work? So internal migration statistically, when you start to aggregate the population, statistically, it's a very reliable process with key life events that really drive people to pack up their lives and move. Packing up your life and moving, particularly interstate or away from the city, not so away from around the corner to a longer distance, it's a big deal, right? Like, it's not something you would just do on a whim. You normally got a life-changing decision that you're making that's driving that move. And these are tied to the life events of people. So a good example would be students. Of course, students, when they finish school, are going to be looking to get to a university. So you see that they are highly mobile people. And as students leave university and start to enter the workforce, or young people develop the skills to be able to start progressing through their career, you see a lot of mobility and internal migration. But of course, later in the life course, you'll see things like retirement and post-retirement life events that make people move. Andrew talked a lot about people retiring outside of cities, for example. So what we do is we jump into Table Builder, get that census data from the 5 year ago address data, and we start to input that into this model, which identifies certain ages in the age structure and fits these curves to each individual one. And then once we've got those fitted curves, we combine them all together to give us a nice, smooth age structure for arrivals and departures for a reason. And it's that underlying census data which tells us about the intensity and the size of these humps in the migration data. And it's the census data that really gives us that powerful information. So let me share an example. This is all very abstract at the moment. So what I've done here is I've combined all the rest of state regions in Australia into one area. So anything that's not a capital city has been combined. So that might feel like a regional area, but don't forget places like the Gold Coast and Geelong, major cities, are part of that definition. And there's roughly 8.5 million residents that live in rest of state areas when you combine them all together. So the blue bars, of course, are the arrivals. So these are people leaving capital cities and arriving in a rest of state area, while the green bars are the departures from regions to cities. And I've got a blue line which shows you the net impact on the population of all those moves. So I'd like to draw your attention to the departures of young adults. So these are the 18-year-olds, the 20-year-olds. You can see a really big spike in the number of young rest of state residents moving to capital cities. So this isn't surprising. The number of universities in our capital cities is much higher than in the regional areas. So it's not surprising that we're seeing this sort of migration. And of course, young people want to enter the labour market with as many options as possible. So you'll see that they'll move to these big cities to take advantage of the larger labour market and the opportunities that provides. So that's not surprising. But once we get past the young people, you'll see that once you get past that cohort of young adults, you'll see that regional areas consistently draw new residents out of capital cities, particularly around the age of retirement. So you'll see there's like a hump kind of at that 65-year-old age group. And the census data allows us to do this sort of model and have these sorts of flows. So it's so valuable for us to use that. So understanding how migration impacts age structures is really important in the Centre for Population. Analysis really gets interesting and is really valuable when you start looking at stuff by age and sex. So what I've got here are some animated population pyramids, and you'll see the year that each one reflects ticking over as they go, and they should loop through. But you can see how the dynamics of internal migration compound over time and change the age structure of these populations. So keep an eye on the right-hand side. That's the rest of state areas combined. And you'll see that over time, that the age structure of the population becomes much narrower and less pyramid-shaped, which shows you that the population is aging. And that's because these regional areas, as we just saw, they export young people and they import older people, which has a big impact on their age structure. Cities are also really interesting. You'll notice there's a bulge developing in those younger adult age groups. So this does have to do with internal migration, but that's predominantly the impact of net overseas migration. So students coming from overseas to study, or temporary migrants looking to work in our labour market and bring their skills and get paid well. Yes. So, of course, once you start looking at these impacts, policymakers and planners are really interested in this sort of changes in the age structure. And that's when we can also then use those census variables that Caroline showed us to start talking about what are the characteristics of these people who are moving and changing the age structures. We can look at employment status, what sort of industry they work in, educational status, household status, all sorts of things with the census data. It's incredibly valuable. So I'll wind it up there. But if you're interested in our forecasts of internal migration trends and our population projections, I recommend you head to our website, population.gov.au, and there's a little screenshot of our homepage there. Here you'll find a range of Centre for Population products and our forecasts. We're preparing to release our annual flagship publication, the Population Statement, which contains our latest projections for all the geographic areas I described and really sets out the trends and implications of population growth in Australia. If you're really looking to incorporate a forward-looking perspective in your analysis, integrating forecasts and talking about the consequences of forecasts with your analysis, I think really lifts your work to a new level. So I recommend having a little look when you're thinking about your work. Please feel free to get in touch with questions. We're always happy to engage with people wanting to use our work. And I can also point you to the Tom Wilson paper that I briefly summarised earlier. So with that, thank you very much for the opportunity. And I'm going to pass back to Tanya.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Alex. It has been a deep dive, but we're now going to keep the seminar flowing and welcome back our speakers, and they're going to answer your questions. And some of those have been already submitted at Poll EV, but it's not too late to jump on and submit your question to be asked. So go to the address on your screen if you'd like to ask a question of one or all of our panellists today. So let's keep moving with the first question. I'm going to go to you if that's okay, Caroline. The question that we have: is it possible to tell whether people were moving from rented dwellings to owned dwellings in the census?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. That is a really interesting question. And unfortunately, the answer is no, that's not possible. And the reason why is that we know someone's living arrangements at the time of the census. So if I think back to, the example of people, say, moving to the Gold Coast, well, in the 2021 census, they would have reported that they lived in the Gold Coast, and maybe they reported that they were living in a 2-bedroom apartment, which they owned. What they also reported was where they lived a year ago and where they lived 5 years ago, but not what their circumstances were at that time. So we know whether they're renting or owning, how many bedrooms, etc., for the current time, but not what it was, a year ago or 5 years ago. So I think when we're looking into the data, we make some inferences maybe about people's circumstances. Are they moving to smaller houses or bigger houses? But we didn't actually know what their base case was.
Thank you so much. Another question is, our audience today would like to know, Andrew and Alex, how the ABS and the Centre for Population work together.
We just give some data, so I might just let that to Alex.
I like to think we have a very close relationship. We're very interested in the data the ABS put out, the demography section and the census in particular, but also the labour force and GDP estimates and stuff like that. So we're really interested in ABS data. So it's really important that we have a close relationship with our colleagues at the ABS, and we try to do that and meet with them frequently, talk about how we're using the data and what we're seeing. And, the result of that is I get invited onto these sorts of panels and get an opportunity to talk about data. So, I try to maintain as close a relationship as possible because we're really big users of ABS data.
We do get really good feedback from Alex and his team. We know our data isn't perfect. We're constantly striving to make it better from our limited data sources, and the feedback that Centre for Population provides really helps improve the quality of that data.
Thank you. Now, this is one for each that I'd like each of you to answer, probably, if that's okay, time permitting. What were you most surprised about from the findings for 1 year ago and 5 years ago from this census? And I'll start with Caroline, and we'll go in the speaker's order, if that's okay. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tanya. So I think, as I said earlier, the census, the 21 census, was taken at such an interesting point in time, measuring how people had moved as a result of the pandemic or around the time of the pandemic. And I think that is probably what I found most surprising, that there still was a lot of movement happening. So if we looked at sort of the arrivals into, say, Melbourne that I focused on, for example, hadn't really changed over that period. And as the departures had changed, and there had still been, just when people had indicated where they lived 1 year ago and 5 years ago, it was a fairly consistent story of the proportion of people who move. So I think what we have seen is more granular when we get into a place like Melbourne and what's been happening there, or drilling into other areas, we can see differences in the trend. But at that broad level, the fact that just over half the population was living in the same address 5 years ago, and that being a relatively consistent observation with the last two censuses, I thought that was interesting.
I keep getting surprised at this frequency of moves. So I've mentioned in my part, 10,000 people move every day in Australia. I need to keep rechecking that because, I just find it hard to comprehend. So if you're 10,000 a day, 70,000 a week, that's the size of the population of Wagga, changing residences every day. So just that frequency. And as Caroline mentioned, it didn't really drop off during the pandemic times. There were some changes in patterns in terms of people actually making that move, still quite high. We're a quite mobile population in Australia.
Yeah, and going last, I'll probably echo a few because I think those are the really interesting things. Like almost 1 in 20 Canberrans will move out of the territory kind of each year. That's just a really high level of turnover, as Caroline pointed out, for both the ACT and the NT. It's a really big driver of population growth and dynamics in these regions. And Melbourne, of course, is quite fascinating. The impact of the lockdown in 2020 really had some big effects on the data, which, understanding where these sort of Melburnians are moving to, and will these numbers return? How will Melbourne come out of this period is a really interesting thing, and the census data really gives us some good insights into that.
Fabulous. Thank you all for sharing your insights and your highlights as well. So that's really all we have time for today. Unfortunately, it'd be great to sit down with you all for a lot longer, but I'd like to thank you by virtual round of applause. So thank you, Andrew, Alex, and Caroline. You've actually taken us on quite the journey exploring migration within Australia. It started with history and it flowed into the latest insights from the 2021 census, and then using the census data for modelling and forecasting and a deep dive into age structures. So thank you all. Now, I know that we didn't get to all of the questions today, and if your question wasn't answered and you would like it answered, you can email client.services@abs.gov.au and we will direct your question accordingly. You can also visit the ABS website and explore the data available from the 2021 census. And indeed, Caroline piqued your interest probably with Table Builder, a tool that you can use to explore the data further. You can also access previous census data seminars and articles like the one that was released today, Migration Within Australia, as well as a lot more. A recording of today's session will be made available in the coming days on the ABS website and the ABS YouTube channel, so you can watch it again. And I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in, and once again, a big thank you to our presenters, Caroline Deans, Andrew Howe and Alex Cleland, for your time and expertise, and all of the people who've made this seminar and all of the census data seminars possible. And a big thank you to you, our viewers, for asking questions in good spirit and tuning in once again. Thank you very much.